Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to White Shadows, the Photograms of Anneliese Hager. This is an event of our monthly series Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Repression, which is sponsored by Allianz Partners. I'm Rachel Stern, Executive Director of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. We research, discuss, publish, and exhibit artists whose life and work was affected by the German Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. I quote, "Art begins there, where chance ends. Nonetheless, chance enriches it in all it contributes. Without this contribution, it would only be comprised of rules. One does not find, one does not search. One resigns or one allows," quote end, says the French poet Pierre Revedi in the epigraph of Anneliese Hager's book on photograms and surrealist poems, published in 1964 as Weiße Schatten, Photogramme, Gedichte. Anneliese Hager is one of a number of modern artists who began their artistic experimentation in Germany after National Socialist cultural policy began to harden against all forms of modern art. Her preferred medium was the photogram, a photographic image made by placing an object directly on or in close proximity to a light-sensitive surface and exposing it to light. Hager called the reversal of light and dark in the resulting contact print White Shadows. Despite being one of the photogram's key 20th century practitioners, Hager has remained virtually unknown. She only surfaced recently, thanks to Lynette Roth. Lynette Roth is Daimler curator of the Busch-Reisinger Museum and head of the Division of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Harvard Art Museums. She received her BA from the University of Michigan and her PhD from Johns Hopkins University. Roth's research focuses on art from German-speaking countries, with publications and exhibitions on the Weimar period. For example, Cologne progressives, Max Beckmann or August Sander. The immediate postwar period, like in her groundbreaking 2018 exhibition Inventur, Art in Germany, 1943 to 55, and contemporary art, for example, Rebecca Horn, Shaya Nashat or Wolfgang Tillmans. Current projects include exhibitions on the photogram, German art and identity after 1980, and a reimagining of the Busch-Reisinger's 18th century porcelain collection with artist Arlene Schecher. Welcome, Lynette.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that kind introduction and for inviting me to present today as part of the Fritz Ascher Society series, Fight or Flight, Stories of Artists Under Repression. In advance of my participation in the series, Rachel and I discussed actually a number of artists whom I might focus on for today's talk, including Max Beckmann, whose actor's triptych, seen here at the Harvard Art Museums, was painted in Amsterdam exile in the early 1940s. And we considered Beckmann quite seriously because I've worked on the artist for many years, as Rachel mentioned, beginning with a book on the renowned collection of paintings by the artists at the St. Louis Art Museum. And of course, this was continued in my work at the Busch-Reisinger Museum and at Harvard with the incredible Beckmann collections there. Beckmann came to the United States in 1947. And in fact, working on Beckmann actually showed me how Americans tend to associate German modernism with those artists whose work was defamed in Nazi Germany, and especially those who left the country, either of their own volition or by force, as emigres or as exiles. And as the curator of the Busch-Reisinger Museum, which is dedicated largely to the art of German-speaking countries, I'm well aware of the important role that those who left Nazi Germany have played in our reception and appreciation of modern German art in the United States. Indeed, the Busch-Reisinger Museum contributed much to this more familiar story, because the core of its modern art collection was actually built at precisely the same time that such work began to be defamed by the Nazis. And as I hope most of you know, also given our large centennial exhibition on the Bauhaus last year, the Busch-Reisinger holds the largest Bauhaus archive outside of Germany. And that's a collection that would be unimaginable without the efforts of emigre artists such as Walter Gropius or Josef and Annie Albers, just to name a few. And we can see a number of installation shots at the Harvard Art Museums here. Anneliese Hager, seen here in a self-portrait from 1947, is not an emigre artist. Hager was not sympathetic to the Nazi regime, nor was she ever a member of the Nazi Party. But racially and socially accepted in Nazi Germany, she remained there throughout the entire period. And in fact, as Rachel mentioned, Hager only began to experiment in earnest with her chosen medium, the cameraless photograph, in the mid-1930s. So in other words, she actually began her artistic experimentation in Germany after National Socialist cultural policy began to harden against all forms of modern art. And that's not an experience that we're as well familiar with, certainly in the United States. Those who stayed in Hitler's Germany have typically been described, often actually by the artists themselves, as having been in a state of inner immigration. And that term is now frequently used for artists either proclaimed degenerate by the Nazis or who worked in a modernist vein earlier in their career, and that regardless of their wartime allegiances. And recent scholarship has shown that the long-standing assumption that artists targeted by the infamous degenerate art campaign were necessarily anti-fascists has rightly been called into question, as Aya Soika described in her wonderful lecture on Emil Nolde as a part of this series earlier this fall. So, not an established artist in the 1930s, Hager did not have any of her work in museum collections and thus was not labeled a degenerate artist. And so today, like Soika's talk, my lecture will thus kind of push up against the two responses to the Nazi regime implied by the series title, Fight or Flight. I would argue that there was no space in Nazi Germany in which art could not be practiced or could be practiced outside the political realities of the time. And as a result, inner immigration, or what we refer to as inner immigration, has as many meanings as the artists to whom the term is applied. And so today we're going to look at Hager as an example of one of those artists. Although not overtly political, Hager's photograms point to overlapping and often contradictory roles that she had as a German woman, a wife, mother, homemaker, romantic partner, and of course, as an artist. And for her, and this is perhaps also surprising, the Nazi period allowed, at least initially, a surprisingly subversive space for art making, one that was notably outside of traditional bourgeois gender roles. The period, however, and the regime's repression of modern art and artists necessarily also kept that development at bay. I came to know Hager's work in preparation for my 2018 exhibition at the Busch-Reisinger Museum, which Rachel mentioned at the outset, called Inventur, Art in Germany, 1943 to 55. And the exhibition deliberately examined artists who experienced both the war and the immediate aftermath in Germany, but on either side of Churchill's Iron Curtain. And these were also the active participants in the defeated country's post-war art scene. Most worked in relative isolation during the war, and many were women. And some, like Hannah Hirsch or Jean Mamin, whose painting opened the show and can be seen here, were already well established in the Weimar period. Here in the gallery with Hager's portrait photogram, we can see it at the far left. We also see, for example, counterclockwise, examples of work by Hermann Glückner, K.O. Goetz, Ruprecht Geiger, there on the far wall, and Norbert Kricke, whose sculptures are here in the foreground. The exhibition argued against the year 1945 as a tabula rasa, or Stunde Null, 0 hour, as the Germans call it, and for a reconsideration of the art of the 20th century, not as a series of breaks, but of continuities, albeit ones often disjointed as a result of war, exile, and trauma. So Hager, her portrait can be seen here again on the right, alongside work by contemporaries Schargesheimer and Karl Struve. Hager really provided a key link between the pre-war, wartime, and post-war period. And that was important for me because I really was arguing for continuity and plurality of the period, one that's so little known, especially to American audiences. And so Inventur showed work such as Hager's as part of a highly charged and remarkably generative landscape, the study of which I believe is necessary for a complete and nuanced understanding of 20th century German art. By looking at modern artists who stayed in Hitler's Germany, the project also invited important questions, and those questions were largely about the role of the creative individual under totalitarianism, beyond fight or flight. So my lecture today takes its title, White Shadows, from Hager's own description of her preferred medium, the cameraless photograph or photogram. A photographic image made by placing an object directly or in close proximity to a light-sensitive surface and, as Rachel mentioned, exposing it thus also to light. With white shadows, Hager is referring to the way in which the absence of light on undeveloped photographic paper creates in the resulting print not darkness, but areas of bright white. So here, for example, we're looking at an untitled work, which is from the 1950s or 1960s. We know that also because of it, the size of the photogram, which they get much larger in her work as the decades go on. But we have to imagine when we're looking at this photogram that the liquid, perhaps glue, that we see across the full surface of these and creating these kinds of undulating forms was actually dark and opaque, where we now see those graphic white lines in the resulting print. And the central forms we see in the photogram were perhaps created by the exposure of shards of glass, which appear as white edges here, but of course would have actually been casting shadows by the refraction of light. So just to give you a sense of how that positive, negative reversal is happening technically. Hager made her first photograms in Aachen in 1935. Here's a picture of her from 1936. And she did so inspired by a close friendship with the then struggling artist K.O. Goetz, who was 10 years her junior, as you can tell looking at these photographs from around the same time. Hager would establish key relationships with other artists throughout her career, and we'll get to a number of those a bit later on. But it was Goetz, who would also be her second husband, who would remain her most significant collaborator. So I first met K.O. Goetz in 2008, and actually the photo you see here of us was from 2011 when Goetz was 97 years of age. And he and his wife, the artist Rissa, really became key resources for me as I developed the project that would become, in 2018, Inventur. At the time, Goetz was, with Konrad Klopek, one of only 2 living artists in my exhibition, and he passed away in 2014 at age 103. Goetz impressed upon me early on the significance of Hager's photograms for the period in question, and this was confirmed by my research, by the exhibition record, and post-war publications. The challenge, though, was actually finding the work, and it took me a while. I mentioned to Rachel the other day that I finally located photograms by the artist shortly before our exhibition publication was set to go to press. So as a curator, not ideal. We tend to work in very long timelines, and I managed to get Hager into the exhibition literally at the last minute. Hager made between 100 and 150 photograms, this is my estimate, during the course of her career. An estimated half of this production, so you have to imagine all of her artwork prior to 1945, was completely destroyed in the bombing of Dresden that year. Also, photograms that have been recorded as sold during her lifetime can actually no longer be located, and only occasionally does her work appear on the market. And so there are a few of her photograms in private collections currently. A significant number of Hager's photograms remained in the artist's possession until her death in 1997. And as a result of my research on Inventur, I managed to secure this estate for the Buschreisinger Museum. And I have to say I'm extremely grateful to Hager's family for entrusting this very important archive to Harvard, and with it making the Buschreisinger the center for the study of Anneliese Hager's photograms. 31 unique works will be the focus of an exhibition that I'm currently planning for 2022. And you'll see just a few of these in our Art Studies Center at the museum here. This destruction of Hager's formative work in the war, and the fact that her photograms are absent from public collections, represent only some of the challenges to broader recognition, however. As we shall see, Hager's reception of the Weimar avant-garde in the 1930s was mediated through publications, but it was also through direct contact with modern artists who had remained in Nazi Germany. And nonetheless, it's perceived as belated. So she kind of came too late to be part of the Weimar avant-garde, and then she becomes known, albeit briefly, in the immediate post-war period, but sort of that connection, how she's really digesting the lessons of the Weimar period through the Nazi period and beyond, is really the focus of my work these days. Despite being one of the technique's key practitioners during and after the war, she has remained virtually unknown compared to her male contemporaries, and is absent from all but a few accounts of the photogram. Despite Hager's active role in the immediate post-war period, when things were still a bit more fluid, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, she, like many women artists, were increasingly overlooked in the 1950s in the Federal Republic. So that was really one of the exciting lessons of the Inventur exhibition, was actually that there was this incredible collaborative moment in those immediate post-war years that then kind of actually became much more difficult for artists outside of what was then the established canon to really make their mark. In what follows, I will examine white shadows, Hager's term for the photogram, as an apt metaphor, therefore, for an artistic project which began under Nazi censure and ended in a different kind of isolation in post-war Germany. Hager described herself from early on as fascinated by the play of light and shadow in nature. And we can see here a small nature study from around 1940, which she titled on the verso, Play of Shadows at the Stream. And for Hager, nature represented not an untouched or feminine space, but a positive, politicized one. One that inspired her and an entire generation of young people in Germany in what was called the Wandervogel movement, until this too was co-opted by nationalistic rhetoric. In her unpublished memoirs, which she began writing in 1971, and which have really been an incredible resource for me as well, Hager developed a theory of light and dark, hell, dunkel. In it, she noted that already as a child, she had a recognition of, quote, the experience that in everything visible, the bright, clear moments appeared even more intense when they happened around dark, opaque, painful things. And this hell dunkel, even if then still childlike, unconscious, has stayed with me my entire life. So Hager's interest in the unique formal qualities of cameraless photography that I described at the outset is thus closely linked to the play of light in nature, to her own childhood, and to the unconscious, which will become important also as a post-war surrealist figure. But the photogram also serves as a metaphor for the historical and political situation in which she lived and worked. And she later described her childhood in rural Wilhelmine, Germany, and we can see her here as a, quote, paradise, still nestled in the final glow of a dying age. And so the artist's lifetime, which spanned both world wars, and her memories of it, offer countless metaphors of darkness and light. Hager's introduction to photography came from the natural sciences. In 1920, uninterested in so-called female occupations or Frauenberufe available to her at the time, Hager began a 2-year training at the Berlin Letteverein, which was a school founded in 1866 to improve the position of women. And of the 3 training programs offered there in photography, there was studio photography, medical technical assistance, or metallography. The 16-year-old Hager, who we see here, chose the latter. And that meant the science of the structure and property of metals. Following an initial training in photography and optics, her coursework included organic and inorganic chemistry, physics, and micro and macro photography. Her experience with the, quote, crystal structures of iron, steel, and copper reminded her of Cubist paintings that she had seen in Berlin exhibitions at the time. So she was already thinking as a very young woman of the way in which the forms that she was seeing in her scientific work were related very much to trends in modern art. From 1922 to 24, Hager worked as a technical assistant for microphotography at Berlin's Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, today the Max Planck Institute, where she tested the properties and manufacture of wool. Here we see her at the far right of the photograph with her colleagues, and at the right we see several published images of her microphotographs made by setting the camera's objective directly on the ocular of the microscope. And at this time, of course, artists such as Karl Blossfeldt and Karl Struve were introducing microphotography as part of that decade's new vision photography. Hager's Hell Dunkel also relates to her growing political consciousness during the Weimar period. In her unpublished memoirs, she cites several times the final stanza from Mac the Knife in Brecht's Three-Penny Opera, which employs the metaphor of dark and light to refer to social inequality in the capitalist system. and I'll just read that stanza for you in English. There are some who are in darkness, and the others are in light, and you see the ones in brightness, those in darkness drop from sight. As Hager's own social consciousness grew, so did her dissatisfaction with her fledgling marriage. Hager met her first husband, Rudolf Braukmeier, while both worked at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. But after their wedding in 1924, he would not allow her to work outside the home. Bored with keeping the household, she read avidly, even pursuing her own private study of organic chemistry. In the 1930s, Braukmeier's political views were becoming increasingly difficult for Hager to reconcile within the marriage. He was the director of the Aachen Weaving School, and thus, as a civil servant, he officially joined the Nazi Party in 1935. He and Hager would eventually divorce in 1943, and she and Goetz would marry in 1945. Although Hager's formative work is no longer extant, she describes her first photographic experiments in 1935 as multiple exposures, including a photo of her head combined with an image of a linden tree. And I had thought about actually recreating that for you, but that seemed like a really bad idea. So we'll continue to look at our photograph of her from 1936 as I read the description of the work that she made. The tree had my eyes, my hair got lost in the foliage, a small branch hung above my mouth, and my neck lengthened into the trunk. The tree and I became one. Hager idiosyncratically refers to such multiple exposures as photomontages, a term typically reserved for photographs cut and rearranged and often rephotographed. Such camera-based experiments ultimately led her to photograms. After the housework was done, and often with her oldest child, she had 3 children by then, eventually she would have 5, her oldest child would be at her side, watching a sort of magic of these objects and their negative reversals. She described the process like this. I began simply. Pine needles and mate tea leaves were the first objects that I laid on the photo paper under red light, exposed briefly, and then developed the papers. Gradually, they got more complicated in their execution. And a work from 1947 is really akin to her description as she continues, quote, forms were cut out of paper, plastic or cellophane. Pieces of broken glass were added. Leaves in all their different natural forms, fibers, wool fibers, hand-spun thread, thin fabric, burlap. Hager's use of multiple exposures and photogram techniques come together in the 1947 portrait. In fact, Goetz also described her early work as, quote, combinations of natural forms, for example, a fir forest, with abstract forms cut out of stencils projected on top. And so the natural forms in Goetz's description, he uses the example of a fir forest, suggests straight photography, whereas the use of stencils and projection implies cameraless techniques. And in portrait, we do have a straight photograph of Hager made by placing a photographic negative in an enlarger and then exposing it to paper. And actually, one of her photo albums, her private photo albums, actually includes the print that then appears in the 1947 portrait. For the photogram portion, Hager modulated light with both sheer material and paper forms. And on the right of the light-sensitive paper, we can see that she placed a stencil cut in the shape of a grasping hand for the length of the exposure, so blocking the light completely. And that's a solid, because it was a solid 2-dimensional mask, it created an area of bright white, which jumps out at us while the gray tones, including her own face, recede. Hager also uses another template, a cutout of her own profile, which I've kind of mimicked below, including her signature bangs and full rounded hairstyle. So we can see that on the right, creating a kind of visual rhyming between the straight photographic portrait and that paper cutout. The same shape is then repeated at the lower left, but flipped. Its exposure now facing right. So I hope you can see that. Two related works by Hager, also from 1947, might help make that more clear. And we also see that what she's doing is she's using a cutout called the positive, and then she's also using the remaining paper called the negative in a single image on the left, this kind of face-off between those two profiles. And in the other photogram, the positive appears in kind of half shadow of her outspread hand, and both also have photograms of tiny white blossoms. In order to achieve particular effects, Hager used multiple exposures and found or made objects, as we've seen, but she also made use of projection. And we can see, because we know that if she took the photograph of herself and printed it, she likely had an enlarger that she was working with, even if it was a rudimentary one. And as we can see in this post-war work, she used a projector, she used a projector to also project scratched or hand-modified glass plates. So as she continues her experiments throughout the 1930s and the 1940s, she keeps pushing and complicating that execution and the layering of forms. And in fact, in 1936 already, she had made photograms and sent them to Goetz, who was already in training at that time with the German army. He then painted her photograms with egg tempera or grease crayon, shared early work lost in the bombing of Dresden. According to Hager, the inspiration for her photogram experiments in 1935 was the work of Man Ray and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, which she got to know through illustrations. She does not specify further, but given its widespread success, she may have seen Moholy-Nagy's 1925 Bauhaus book, Painting, Photography, Film, a publication so popular that in 1927 it appeared in a second modified edition. It also included both Moholy's earliest essays on making photographic images without a camera and illustrated his work alongside that of Man Ray. Hager might have also encountered Moholy-Nagy's photogram technique not in the Bauhaus publication, but as a pitch to art enthusiasts, specifically women, in the popular magazine Uhu. In 1928, the magazine published an article by Moholy-Nagy, the inventor of the photogram technique. Pictured is a woman at lower right, placing objects on a sheet of photo paper with the aid of a desk lamp. And she really is this kind of vision of the new woman of the Weimar period. To the left, another image is described as the result of exposing a metal grater to sunlight. The article suggests that with photograms, readers, quote, with taste and imagination, can achieve attractive and surprising effects. Finally, a use for old razor blades, reads the caption below the photogram on the right. The technique offering not just a solution for the doldrums of domestic life, but also all that pesky household waste. In 1930, just 2 years after Moholy-Nagy encouraged the readers of Uhu to make photograms, an article entitled Photographic, Photography Without a Camera, Painting Without a Brush, appeared in the same magazine. Rather than household objects, amateur photographers were encouraged by author Tony van Haken-Schramen to use paper cutouts to mimic photography, or better, painting. Tiny holes in the paper stencils create dark areas and modulated tones in the finished image. You can see sort of the different ways that readers were encouraged to try this out on the left. But what was the example used? Well, not surprisingly, it was a profile image of a woman, not unlike Hager's own profile in her 1947 portrait. Of the Uhu article, Floris Neusus aptly noted, quote, "Here, the subversive form of the photogram has been decoupled from its radical beginnings as a pastime for imaginative ladies." And I should say that Neusus and his wife Renate Heine, both artists and photogram experts, have been an incredible resource for me in my work on Hager. And Neusus sadly passed away earlier this year, and I'm very grateful that I was able to visit them shortly before the pandemic hit. The association of the photogram with women was nothing new. Popular manuals for amateur photographers in the late 19th and early 20th century cite widespread interest in the technique. And in her recent publication on the photogram, media and material historian Katharina Steidl has shown the ways in which the technique was already coded female in the 19th century. Hager's exclusion, I would argue, from the modernist canon may thus also be the result of the link between photograms and women, and the fact that Hager was one. The association with women also extends to the tradition of paper cutouts, or Scherenschnitte, and many amateur practitioners of Scherenschnitte were actually women, but official creators tended to be men. In a post-war photomontage of Hager, which we can see here, and again, we get her featured in profile with that sort of fabulous hairstyle that we've come to recognize, Martha Hüpfner places a cutout of Hager atop one of her own photograms. Paper cutouts harken back to a domestic female activity which Hager herself describes in her memoirs, paper dolls in her youth and patterns for clothing she made for children. After her husband and her companion, K.O. Goetz, were conscripted in 1939, Hager moved from the small village where she was still living with her children to Dresden. And there she enjoyed greater anonymity and joined a circle of like-minded artists, including Otto Dix, Edmund Kesting, and Wilhelm Lachnit. And she met with them regularly at the home of Swedish Bauhaus-trained artist Mai Hemberg and her sister Isa, also about whom little is known. We see her in a portrait by Kesting in his signature technique that also makes use of multiple exposures. When on military leave, Goetz painted in the Dresden apartment and Hager made photograms there. And the two of them even once collaborated on a painting. We see them portrayed here together by Kesting, also in 1943. Goetz, notably, appears in Kesting's image twice legibly. Hager appears once solely as a shadow, also prompting a reading of this work akin to the reception of the work of artist couples more generally, where the woman is often overshadowed by her male counterpart. Notably, the shadow of Hager here bears close similarity to the profile cutout in her portrait 5 years later. While living in Dresden, Hager placed her and Goetz's artwork in a small upstairs storage room of the apartment for safekeeping, quote, dry and protected from unwelcome glances. Her home became what she called an island, a bright spot amidst the darkness of conflict and war. We see her pictured here, as in previous photographs, at the window, the liminal space between inside and out, darkness and light. In the bombing of Dresden on February 13th, 1945, Hager's apartment was completely destroyed. She narrowly escaped with her children, but lost all of her and her family's possessions, including, as I have mentioned, her earliest photograms. Until 1950, Hager then lived as a refugee in Königswörde near Hanover with Goetz and several of her children. In the two barn rooms where the family stayed, One was designated the studio and was primarily for goods. And we can see him working down there in the lower left of a page in a photograph in Hager's private photo album, and actually a wonderful photograph of the two artists in the upper right-hand corner in front of their work respectively. So you can also get a sense of the scale on the right there on the wall of Hager's photograms from the 1940s. Not until 1947, with photographic material provided by the German photographer Umbo, was Hager able to begin making photograms again, one of which was portrait. They had no running water in Königswerda, and she didn't have a dark room, so Hager did the work at night. Actually, after she had spent the day doing odd jobs to support the family and also, of course, taking care of her children. Initially inspired by the work of Man Ray and Moholy-Nagy, Hager's photograms are nonetheless distinctly different. In Broom, the first publication to publish his photograms, Moholy-Nagy described the possibilities of controlling the action of light on the light-sensitive material, quote, by means of lenses and mirrors, by light passed through fluids like water, oil, acids, crystal, metal, glass, tissue, etc. As Renate Heine has shown, these actions were a mainstay of Moholy-Nagy's earliest photograms, but these were techniques that he actually increasingly abandoned after his move with the Bauhaus to Weimar. These techniques remained, however, the staple of Hager's own practice for decades, as she purposefully exploited the fluidity and varying transparencies of fabric or feathers, soap bubbles, glass, and glue. In fact, it was this ongoing fascination with the materiality of ordinary and overlooked things, she calls them sort of just the banal objects of everyday life, and her interest in discovering new kinds of effects that would closely align her with the European avant-garde movement known as COBRA, an acronym for the founders' home cities of Copenhagen, Brussels, and Amsterdam. And in 1949, she exhibited as one of only 3 women and as the sole photographer in the now legendary International COBRA exhibition, and we can see an installation view of that on the left. Edward Jaguar, a COBRA collaborator, compared her work to surrealist poetry. Quote, her photograms, he wrote, aim more to the creation of new spaces, places of takeoff for wonder than pure plasticity. For Jaguar, Hager made Man Ray look like a strict constructivist. Indeed, as I have discussed with Neuhaus and Heine, Hager's photograms have much more in common with the work of Christian Schad or later of Raoul Hausmann, whose photopictograms of the 1950s were often drawn in sawdust. Hager's memoirs emphasize the negative side of notions of progress, from the Industrial Revolution to the Second World War. And this is a seemingly counterintuitive stance, given that photography, her chosen medium, is typically associated with or understood as technological or at least mechanical. And the photogram, however, bears an indexical relationship to the outside world in a way that camera-based photography does not. But we've seen, as we've seen from the beginning, the natural world played an outsized role in Hager's experiments. But her approach to the medium often eschewed the legibility of the source material. So I like to say it was defined by, not by concreteness, but by slippage. And we're getting that already in those very early multiple exposures. In Jaguar's words, this was how she would create new spaces for the post-war period. Despite Hager's active participation in the burgeoning German art scene immediately after the war, and we see her here with contemporaries at the Zimmergalerie Frank in Frankfurt, by the mid-1950s, Hager, like many of her female contemporaries, became overshadowed by an increasingly masculinist culture. The Federal Republic of Germany at the time signaled the return of a conservative sexual and social order. And the first Documenta exhibition in 1955, which sort of served as the other bookend of my exhibition Inventur, the Documenta in 55 would define our understanding of German art for years to come, and yet it featured the post-war work of only 2 women and not of any photographers. In 1964, Hager published Weiße Schatten, White Shadows, a limited edition book of her poems from the 1950s and her photograms dating from 1948 to 1963, including a number of photograms that we looked at today. The cover of each publication is also a unique photogram. White Shadows appeared just prior to Hager's divorce from Goetz, and her latest photograms are dated to only shortly thereafter. So the latest dated photogram that I've found is from 1965. The compendium thus signifies the end of her active art making, which had begun with their initial collaboration circa 30 years earlier. A late photogram from 1963, a lost visage, seen here, an image made by folding and exposing a gauzy fabric or maybe a metal screen against the photo paper. A lost visage recalls Hager's facial features blending into the background of her 1947 portrait. Here, however, the technique is simple. In the photogram's characteristic reversal, the human element, or what we read here as the human element of the face, is both present and absent. The photogram was, for Hager, not only significant for its provocative, formal, and often surprising reversals, but also for its relationship to historical darkness and light, and who or what emerges from the shadows. The white shadows of a photogram making, in Hager's vision, what would otherwise be obscured, the whitest, the brightest, the most noticeable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynette. This is really amazing work that I wouldn't know of if I wouldn't have seen the exhibition. So, and thank you for giving a little bit more context in your talk right now. And we have the first questions. Please, everybody, keep asking questions. David Stern says, thank you, Lynette Roth, for a great lecture. Having grown up in post-war Germany and with works of Karl Otto Goetz, Fred Thiele, Ruprecht Geiger, among others, I viewed Karl Otto Goetz mostly as an epigone of the American abstract expressionist movement. Could you elaborate a bit on the influence Hager had on Goetz and or vice versa?
Yes, thanks, David, for your question. You know, I also thought of the German informel, I think, as most of us did, as sort of the German version of abstract expressionism. And what I've come to understand is that a lot of that actually happened later. So in the 1950s, we get this kind of stylization of Goetz as a kind of German Jackson Pollock, right? So there is actually an incredible photo series of him in his studio once he's teaching at the Düsseldorf Art Academy in 1959, painting on the floor. Of course, Goetz used all kinds of different tools, handmade tools, in fact, some which we see again in the practice of his student, Gerhard Richter. But actually, Goetz was coming out of a long-standing engagement with surrealism. And I think he and Hager, already in the 1940s, we know that Goetz was reading surrealist publications from other countries, from Scandinavia, from France, and living as he was also together with Hager, although she doesn't mention those publications specifically. the sense is that the two of them were really embarking on teaching themselves about European surrealism. And in fact, after the war in 1946, the two of them together start to translate Nadeau's History of Surrealism from French into German. So something I didn't even get into here is actually Hager's role as a translator, which is what she dedicates herself to after she gives up making photograms in the 1960s. She works primarily as a translator. She's, of course, also a poet, as is Goetz. And so both of them, their kind of shared love of language and surrealism, I think is really where this creative exchange is happening. And I'll just add real quick, I think it was important for me as I was working on the Inventur exhibition, my conversations also with Konrad Klappek. And Konrad Klappek is an artist who we think of as sort of the German version of pop art, right? And Konrad Klappek said to me, he was a little skeptical of Goetz initially at the Düsseldorf Art Academy, where they were both teaching, until he realized that he and Goetz were indebted to the same surrealist tradition. So again, you know, one artist working in complete abstraction and the other in this kind of, you know, sort of forcible return to, you know, precision and figuration, and yet those two artists also had found a common language. So as always, it's so much more complicated than we tend to expect.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be fun otherwise. So,
yes.
So why does Hager stop producing photograms? Is that connected to her divorce, or did she just feel that the medium that she explored all in the medium that there was to explore, or how do you understand that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, obviously I've thought about that a lot, and the fact that she puts together this compendium, and it really is that, it's looking back, you know, to the work that obviously is available for her to use after the war. She had written in a letter to Floris Neusus, who had reached out to her for his history of the photogram that he was compiling. He wrote to her in the 1980s, and she wrote to him that she stopped making photograms because there was not any interest in the medium. And I think there's obviously something to that. I mean, at the time in the 60s, you know, the art world is changing. The focus is, you know, a lot on performance, photography, perhaps and you know, emergence of video. You know, there are just sort of different ways in which the media are being used. And, you know, we even see artists like, you know, Christian Schad not returning to that medium again until the 60s. And that work's also never really kind of become a part of what we, what we think about. So she was sensing, I think, that the photogram was, you know, not as much of an interest in the art world. And I think, again, the focus then on her poetry and on translation really took over. But that's the closest thing we have to as an answer of why she stopped.
Yeah. So Carl Lahan asked whether Hager made regular photographs, and if so, whether any survived.
She did. In fact, she did a lot during the 20s and 30s. And I showed some of those as a part of the photo albums. So the photo albums are now in the archives at the Harvard Art Museums. Those were then any pre-war photos she got back from people after the war. So if she'd sent someone a photograph. So for example, that wonderful, I can go back to it, that wonderful photograph, which is quite small, the study of the stream. There are others of the snow, nature. I mean, she was avid hiker. She loved being out in nature, and she often took photographs while she was doing that. But again, most of those were destroyed during the war. But she never saw them in the same way as she saw her photograms. So she doesn't include them in her White Shadows publication. She doesn't really talk about it as photography. It really is a commitment as an artist to the photogram technique. And I just like to make this link because obviously straight photography leads her to the photogram.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do you think her choice of medium had to do with the rarity of other materials, like painting materials, or you know, in the direct post-war years and in the last, like, in your time of research from 43 on?
Definitely, she actually struggled with the fact that she worked with photography in the immediate post-war period, whereas Goetz was beginning to use, you know, whatever he could to paint again. You know, there's a wonderful story of him, you know, using the horse's tail in the barn and stealing it and making brushes out of it. I mean, actually, a lot of the Inventur exhibition, Inventur means a sort of stock taking, but also literally a kind of taking inventory, right? So one of the themes of the exhibition was how artists turned to, you know, non-traditional materials, really whatever was at hand, because they didn't have the artistic materials or the access to them in that immediate post-war period in particular. Hager didn't have the photographic supplies. And in fact, for a long time, I didn't know where she got them from. And I thought, if they're living in this barn and there's, you know, they have nothing, I mean, literally nothing, you know, how is she making photograms in 1947? And thankfully, Goetz mentions it also in a letter to Floris Neusus in the 1980s, that the photographic material came from Umbo, who was a well-known photographer and was reestablishing his practice and was, you know, had greater wealth at the time, and sent her the supplies. So thankfully, she was able to start doing the work again in 1947. But I do think that a lot of what she's using to make the photograms, also in those early years in the 30s, you know, she's using whatever's around. And yet she mentioned cellophane too. So she's thinking, you know, she's thinking outside the box. She's also thinking about relatively new materials, and she's relying also on her scientific background. You know, you get a mention of wool and thread, and, you know, she has an incredible understanding of those materials as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now my last question, Lynette. Susan Schender asked whether you were able to meet her children or, you know, descendants, whether you were able to collect some memories from them.
Yes, and I have to say I'm incredibly indebted to the family. So this is a story about relationships and how, you know, I managed to, through various collectors and various artists from the period or family of those artists, actually find Hager's daughter, one of her daughters, who then had the estate from her mother. And we were then able to acquire it for the museum, also with the help of a collector who had been engaging with the family for some time, named Ernst August Rüdiger, and he was actually the one who lent us the two photograms for the exhibition, because I was working under such a deadline. But then I did get to know her daughter, Waltraud Kupsch, and her husband, Wolfgang Kupsch, and we've spent a lot of time talking about the work of Anneliese Hager, and, you know, how I can also best tell this story and fill the gap in the art historical record of her role, really, you know, for decades as an artist in Germany. And so it's been a wonderful experience for me, and it will continue in 2022 with the exhibition at the Busch-Reisinger Museum. So I hope once we're all able to do things like that again, that you'll all join me in Cambridge to see some of this incredible work in person.
We can't wait. That's the sentiment also from the audience, that we're very much looking forward to see the originals now, to see your exhibition. So thank you so much, Lynette. This is our last Zoom event of 2020. Early this year, as COVID-19 caused us to stay home and our exhibitions were closed, the digital lecture series Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Oppression was one of the initiatives which was born out of our strong desire to connect with you. We're grateful for your enthusiastic response and support. And we are already planning exciting events for 2021, starting with Biala, the rash acts of rescue and escape on January 6th. But for now, we wish you happy and healthy holidays and a good start of 2021. All best wishes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.